Vivian arrived at that beach convinced it was her territory, a glamorous shoreline known for attracting the country's most powerful influencers, a place where status decided who deserved to be seen. Then she noticed Joshua, sitting barefoot in the sand, smiling to himself, completely at peace. That single image ignited something ugly inside her. With cold arrogance, she muttered, "He thinks he belongs here," and the racism she carried without shame took control. She began humiliating him openly, throwing cruel remarks meant to strip him of dignity and force him to leave. Conversations stopped. Eyes turned. The beach fell silent. Joshua felt the sting of every word, the familiar weight of injustice pressing on his chest. Still, he chose restraint. Wanting no conflict, only rest, he stood up, walked away, and left behind not weakness, but a memory that would not be forgotten. Weeks later, fate tightened its grip. Joshua returned to work and stepped into a high-level meeting about the new face of his company, and there she was, Vivian. Confident, just seconds before, she froze in disbelief as recognition hit her. The room shifted. Joshua met her eyes and let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. In that instant, the balance of power changed. He said nothing cruel. He didn't need to. From that moment on, Joshua used intelligence, patience, and precision, setting in motion a reckoning Vivian never saw coming. What began as humiliation on a beach would become something far bigger, a reversal she could not escape. But before we proceed, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's understand how this story truly began. Joshua hadn't taken a proper vacation in 5 years, not since the relentless pressure of growing JJ Cosmetics from a small family venture into a respected international brand had consumed every waking moment of his life. Work had become his constant companion, a relentless tide of meetings, decisions, and the quiet, persistent ache of responsibility. When he finally booked a week at an upscale beach known for its exclusivity, a private club that drew celebrities, influencers, and the elite seeking sun-soaked reprieve, he felt a small, precious flutter of anticipation in his chest. He arrived early in the morning, when the air still carried the lingering coolness of dawn and the scent of salt and sunscreen mingled softly. Carefully, he laid his towel on the sand, smoothing it out with meticulous care, and settled in under the warm, embracing sun, letting himself breathe fully for the first time in years. The golden light kissed his skin, the soft rhythm of the waves against the shore, a gentle balm to the mind worn thin by decisions and deadlines. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep deep, almost painfully, into his muscles, and allowed himself a tiny smile, a quiet, private acknowledgement that he deserved this brief respite, this rare chance to feel unhurried. His thoughts wandered, untethered, drifting toward memories of his late mother and the humble beginnings that had taught him the value of hard work, humility, and integrity. He inhaled deeply, hoping the peace would linger, that the weight on his shoulders could soften, even if only slightly. That same day, Vivian arriving with the characteristic flourish and spectacle that defined her life. As a prominent socialite and influencer whose family owned the beach club, her presence was meant to radiate prestige, attention, and unquestionable dominance over the space. Her entourage flanked her like shadows, ensuring every step she took was noticed and remarked upon. The moment her gaze fell upon Joshua, spread on the sand, calmly existing in the place she considered exclusively hers, something inside her coiled with instant, unexamined prejudice. She muttered under her breath, a sharp, venomous edge to the words, "Does he really think he belongs here?" Without hesitation, her arrogance spilled outward, cutting across the air with deliberate force. She began to humiliate him publicly, her words dripping with disdain, colored with the implicit racism of someone who had always assumed superiority as birthright. Other patrons turned, curious and uncomfortable, their whispers threading through the sunlit space as she escalated, relentless. Joshua, feeling the familiar sting of being treated as less than he was, kept his expression composed, a calm veneer over a tightening chest. His desire was not confrontation. He only wished to exist quietly in the rare warmth of this morning, to breathe and feel sunlight on his skin without judgment or derision. He rose slowly, gathering his belongings with deliberate care, each movement careful, restrained, almost meditative, as if in these small, meticulous actions he could reclaim dignity from the embarrassment she sought to impose. His heart, however, carried a weight beyond the immediate humiliation, a deep, resonant ache that spoke of years of being underestimated, overlooked, or judged not for who he was, but for the color of his skin. His eyes met Vivian's for a fleeting moment, and he saw in her gaze nothing but emptiness, a reflection of superficiality and entitlement. It was an emptiness he had learned not to respond to with anger, but with quiet, enduring grace. Nearby, a young waitress at the beach bar, Sarah, approached cautiously. Her heart tightened at the scene, recognizing the injustice before her eyes. She offered Joshua a small kindness, a drink on the house, hoping to lend some comfort amid the humiliation. But Vivian, never one to tolerate even the hint of compassion directed towards someone she deemed inferior, snapped at Sarah with sharp, threatening words. She suggested that even the smallest act of service toward Joshua could cost Sarah her job, wielding her authority and prejudice like a weapon. Sarah recoiled, torn between the instinct to help and the fear of losing her livelihood. Joshua, sensing her distress, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity. He spoke softly, the weight of his calm presence grounding her. "Don't risk your job over ignorance. Karma has a way of balancing things." His words were more than comfort, they were a subtle act of resistance, a quiet refusal to let cruelty dictate actions. Leaving a generous tip, he turned back to his preparations. Each step measured and deliberate, embodying patience and dignity in the face of baseless scorn. Walking to his car, the sun warming his back, Joshua reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed his assistant, his voice a serene contrast to the storm he had endured moments before. "Push back the vacation. I have some urgent business to handle," he said, not with frustration, but with the calm decisiveness that had defined his life and his leadership. Though the humiliation stung, it did not define him. It was a transient shadow against the broader arc of his character, a test of endurance he met with quiet strength. As he drove away, leaving the sunlit beach behind, Joshua's mind lingered on the paradox of the human heart, the capacity for cruelty juxtaposed with the possibility for grace. He carried both sadness and hope. The sharp pang of injustice softened by the unwavering knowledge that true character, true belonging, was measured not in privilege or entitlement, but in empathy, resilience, and the quiet courage to act rightly even when unnoticed. The waves behind him seemed to echo that truth, relentless, enduring, carrying forward both pain and promise in their eternal rhythm. Several months had passed since the incident at the beach, though the memory lingered in Joshua's mind like a persistent echo, a reminder of the fragile balance between civility and cruelty. The selection process for a brand face was a meticulous endeavor, one that required patience, observation, and a delicate understanding of character as much as appearance. JJ Cosmetics had grown beyond a company, it had become a mission. A tribute to Joshua's grandmother's recipes and to his late mother, a woman who had spent her life serving others and enduring indignities with quiet dignity. Her legacy was stitched into the fabric of every product, every campaign. And Joshua carried her lessons as a guiding principle in every decision he made. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the JJ Cosmetics headquarters, casting a soft glow across the polished boardroom table. The air buzzed with anticipation as staff members whispered in hushed excitement. arranging notes, adjusting lights, and reviewing last-minute details for the launch of the new Face of JJ campaign. This campaign was meant to embody elegance, sophistication, and the understated power of authenticity. Faces from diverse backgrounds had been carefully considered, each candidate chosen not only for aesthetic appeal, but for the resonance of their story, their resilience, and the integrity they carried in their own lives. Joshua entered the room quietly, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. There was a subtle gravity in the way he moved, a rhythm honed from years of balancing ambition with principle, authority with empathy. The team straightened instinctively, a mixture of respect and excitement warming the air. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the energy but not letting it overwhelm him, his focus already threading through the intentions behind the campaign. The stakes were high, not for profit alone, but for the affirmation of values his mother had instilled, that beauty, real beauty, was inseparable from character. Vivian arrived shortly after, her entrance deliberate and unmistakable. She moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to attention, sunglasses shading eyes that rarely missed a detail, her tiny dog nestled in the crook of her arm. Her arrival carried the subtle rustle of silk and designer accents, and she treated the staff with a thinly veiled disdain, her glance lingering with imperceptible judgment before sweeping past the people who had greeted her with polite smiles. The room's energy shifted slightly, the staff caught between the thrill of celebrity presence and the discomfort of her cold assessment. When she was finally introduced to Joshua, her carefully constructed composure faltered, and a subtle flush of recognition colored her cheeks. She had assumed the meeting was a formality, a superficial engagement with a man she did not expect to remember her or command her attention. But the recognition was unmistakable. The memory of the beach, of his quiet dignity in the face of her cruelty, surfaced unbidden. Her sunglasses no longer fully concealed her unease, and her posture stiffened, betraying the calculated elegance she wielded like armor. Joshua remained composed, his expression serene yet edged with a quiet strength. He leaned back slightly in his chair, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of his lips, not a smile of triumph, but of measured acknowledgement. His voice, calm and even, carried across the room as he spoke. "We've met before. Vivian has a memorable way of making people feel welcome." The words were precise, weighted with the memory of past indignity, yet delivered without malice. They hung in the air, a quiet mirror reflecting not only Vivian's behavior, but the ethical chasm between them. Vivian's eyes darted momentarily, searching for some anchor in the room, some justification for her prior arrogance. She opened her mouth, likely intending a flippant comment, but found herself constrained by the subtle authority he exuded and the unspoken acknowledgement of her actions. Around her, the staff sensed the tension, some shifting uneasily, others caught in the silent power of the encounter. Joshua's calm gaze was unwavering, a reminder that true control did not need to assert itself through aggression. It existed in integrity, composure, and the quiet knowledge of one's own worth. The room seemed to breathe with the weight of history and consequence. Vivian's dog whimpered softly, a fragile counterpoint to the tension, and she adjusted its leash with a shaky hand. For the first time, her perfectly curated presence showed cracks fleeting, almost imperceptible, but deeply revealing. Joshua noticed, of course. He always noticed, in the same way he had observed the subtleties of human behavior in every interaction that mattered. His mother's lessons were alive in him, guiding not just the operation of a company, but the cultivation of justice, empathy, and dignity in human relationships. The staff continued their preparations, but the encounter had settled a quiet gravity over the room. There was an unspoken understanding that this was no longer just a campaign launch, was a test of character, of humility, and of the capacity for growth. Joshua's subtle, precise words had set the tone, that behavior, kindness, and accountability were as central to JJ Cosmetics as its formulations, its branding, and its reach. Vivian, accustomed to commanding spaces through wealth and status, now confronted the unfamiliar discomfort of being observed and measured, not for influence, but for integrity. Joshua allowed a pause, giving space for the quiet ripple of awareness to sink in. He felt the faint pulse of satisfaction not in schadenfreude, but in the acknowledgement that sometimes life, through its patient insistence, offers lessons more enduring than any reprimand. The gentle hum of activity resumed around him, yet the moment lingered, heavy with expectation and possibility. In that room, the collision of past and present set the stage for change, not only in a brand campaign, but in the subtle, fragile development of conscience and accountability. He straightened, finally, his mind moving forward to the tasks at hand. The campaign awaited, with all its potential for inspiration and authenticity. And as he watched Vivian adjust her posture and attempt composure once more, he understood that this reunion, uncomfortable as it was, might sow the seeds of self-awareness she had long resisted. In that quiet, tension-filled space, the possibility for redemption hung in the air, fragile but real, as delicate and promising as the first rays of sunlight catching on the waves of the beach months ago. Vivian's apology came out in fragmented bursts, her words tripping over themselves as though they were unfamiliar in her mouth. I'm sorry, she stammered, each syllable carefully measured, forced through clenched teeth. It was a bad day. A misunderstanding, really. I didn't mean. Her gaze darted toward Joshua, attempting to gauge whether charm could smooth over the edges of her recklessness, if a carefully placed smile could erase the memory of the beach incident. But Joshua, calm and steady as ever, let her words float in the air without acceptance, letting the weight of past actions linger. He regarded her with a subtle, unshakable composure, the kind of stillness that reflected not indifference, but clarity. His voice, quiet yet carrying an undeniable authority, broke through the tension. I believe in growth, he said, each word deliberate, resonant with conviction. Let's see if you align with our brand's emphasis on kindness and inclusivity. The sentence was simple, but it contained layers she could not charm away. Accountability, expectation, and the recognition that character was as visible as any campaign photo, as essential as any product on a shelf. For a moment, Vivian's confidence faltered. She had built a life on appearances, on being the center of attention, on assuming deference from those around her. Now, confronted with someone who measured value not by social status or inherited wealth, but by empathy and integrity, she felt a small, unfamiliar pressure. Joshua didn't terminate her contract immediately. He didn't need to. Instead, he imposed a form of subtle trial, a measured intervention designed not for punishment alone, but for reflection. She would spend time on the factory floor, witnessing the careful, skilled hands that transformed humble ingredients into products that carried the legacy of care and respect. She would visit community programs supported by JJ Cosmetics, encountering people whose lives were touched by kindness and support, observing authenticity that demanded recognition and humility. Vivian agreed reluctantly, masking her irritation behind a practiced smile. Yet the tension behind her eyes betrayed impatience. Later, away from Joshua's watchful gaze, she ranted to her agent, frustration spilling over with venomous understatement. I'm tolerating the help. Can you believe it? I have to involve myself with them, with all of this. It's absurd. Her words were sharp, laced with a sense of entitlement and disbelief, revealing a vulnerability she would never have admitted aloud, the discomfort of being stripped of the control and admiration she so heavily relied upon. Joshua, however, did not leave matters to chance. He observed discreetly, relying first on standard security measures to monitor interactions, ensuring that Vivian's behavior could be accurately assessed without intrusion. As days passed, it became apparent that her unrepentance and disdain were not limited to the private corners of her thoughts. They crept into her actions, subtle yet unmistakable. Joshua, recognizing that mere oversight would not suffice, engaged private investigators to gather a fuller understanding of her behavior. The investigations were conducted ethically, quietly, documenting her interactions, both in the community spaces and within the company, revealing patterns that her superficial charm could no longer conceal. On the factory floor, Vivian moved with hesitation, attempting to emulate engagement, her movements awkward against the rhythm of skilled workers who operated with natural ease. She delivered smiles that did not reach her eyes, offered curt nods when guided through procedures. Yet she began to witness moments that chipped subtly at her defenses. A young employee sharing a personal story with gentle pride. A volunteer explaining how the program had transformed a child's confidence. And a worker carefully checking the integrity of a product with an almost reverent patience. These interactions, simple yet profoundly human, contrasted sharply with the world Vivian was accustomed to, a world where presentation often eclipsed substance. Joshua observed from a distance, his presence quiet, measured, ensuring that the lessons could be absorbed organically. He allowed the discomfort to exist, knowing that true growth required recognition of one's own limitations. An encounter with humility that could not be faked. He noted the subtle flickers of unease in her expressions, the clenched jaw, the brief tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes lingered too long on the genuine smiles of others. These were not victories for him, but opportunities for reflection. Chances for her to confront the consequences of her actions in a tangible, human context. The community programs, designed to uplift and support, became mirrors for Vivian's own shortcomings. Children approached her with trust, expecting warmth and care, and she found herself momentarily paralyzed, unsure of how to engage authentically. Each forced laugh, each polite nod, was a reminder that charm alone could not substitute for empathy. Joshua's strategy was deliberate. He did not need confrontation, nor public humiliation. He allowed the truth of her conduct and the undeniable grace of those around her to act as instruments of insight. Behind the veneer of her frustration, there were subtle moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, where self-awareness stirred. A child's question about why everyone deserved kindness. A worker's quiet pride in crafting products with care. A volunteer's unshakable patience. All these confronted her habitual superiority with a quiet, relentless insistence on conscience. Vivian found herself forced into reflection, though she would not admit it aloud, her mind wrestling with dissonance between her ingrained habits and the ethical expectations surrounding her. Joshua's approach was rooted not in punishment, but in transformation. He recognized that meaningful growth required space, observation, and gentle yet firm accountability. By the end of her initial assignments, Vivian had been confronted repeatedly, not with anger, but with clarity, with the quiet power of human dignity and responsibility. The cat-and-mouse game was no longer a contest of charm or control. It was an unfolding lesson in humility, integrity, and the recognition that the world and the people in it would not bend to entitlement alone. In this delicate tension, Joshua allowed for the possibility of change to emerge organically. The path was slow, uncertain, and uncomfortable for Vivian. Yet it was precisely in this discomfort that seeds of understanding began to take root. And though she did not yet fully grasp the depth of the lesson, each measured encounter, each observation of genuine human warmth and care, laid the groundwork for eventual recognition that character, patience, and empathy were far more enduring measures of value than wealth, influence, or appearance. Joshua stood at the edge of the community center, observing the morning light spill softly across the worn floors and the laughter of children echoing against the high ceilings. The direction of the campaign had shifted subtly but profoundly. Gone were the days of overly staged, glamorous shoots. Instead, he embraced an authenticity that had always resonated deeply with him, the kind of beauty rooted in character, resilience, and humanity. The concept, raw and real, aimed to capture moments untouched by the gloss of makeup or the veneer of performance, moments that revealed the essence of a person and the quiet, enduring beauty of life itself. The transition from luxury to authenticity was deliberate, designed not only to reflect the brand's evolving values, but to serve as a mirror for those who had been placed on pedestals by privilege rather than merit. For Joshua, this was more than marketing. It was an extension of the legacy his mother had left him, a tangible way to honor the lives of those often overlooked, those who carried dignity quietly amidst adversity. The community center, modest yet full of vitality, was a space alive with stories, with laughter and struggle intertwined in a rhythm that demanded attention and respect. Vivian arrived precisely on schedule, her presence an ostentatious contrast to the simplicity of the environment. She stepped through the doorway with sunglasses shielding her eyes, designer heels clicking against the floor, and her tiny dog perched perfectly in her arm. Her expectation was clear: luxury, opulence, control. The world she inhabited thrived on curated perfection, and the idea of serving lunch for candid photographs struck her as beneath her. She cast a quick, dismissive glance around the room, taking in the paint-chipped walls, the mismatched chairs, and the eager faces of children who were unaware of her fame or her status. Joshua approached with a warm smile, his hands relaxed and welcoming. He moved naturally among the children and staff, helping set tables, arranging meals, and sharing quiet words with volunteers and youth alike. His presence was unassuming yet grounding, demonstrating a genuine engagement that contrasted sharply with Vivian's carefully maintained facade. He encouraged interactions, subtly guiding the children to feel valued and seen, to understand that their participation in the campaign was not only recognized, but deeply respected. Each smile exchanged, each careful placement of a plate or napkin carried weight, significance, and sincerity. Vivian, however, struggled visibly with the shift in expectations. She offered half-hearted gestures of participation, serving sandwiches with stiff precision, her smiles mechanical and fleeting, her muttered insults quiet. Venomous comments slipped off her tongue when the camera was not trained on her. Whispered judgments about the children, the volunteers, and the simplicity of the setting. "Honestly, this is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath once, stepping back to adjust her sunglasses, as if to shield herself from the reality around her. Yet the lens of the camera captured not only her movements, but the contrasts inherent in the scene. It's the warmth of genuine connection against the cold performance of entitlement. Joshua noticed her tension, but he did not respond with reprimand or confrontation. Instead, he continued his work with the children and staff, allowing his actions to speak where words might fail. He knelt to meet the eyes of a shy boy carefully arranging napkins, praising the precision of his work. He laughed quietly with a group of girls, listening as they shared their thoughts on the creative process of helping with the photographs. Every gesture was intentional, a quiet model of empathy and presence, demonstrating the kind of leadership and authenticity that could not be fabricated. As the day unfolded, Vivian's discomfort grew, evident in the subtle tightness of her shoulders, the almost imperceptible frown lines that deepened when she was caught off guard by a child's spontaneous question or observation. A little girl, holding a carefully folded paper heart, asked her why she was smiling if she didn't seem happy. Vivian's response faltered. Her rehearsed charm collided with genuine curiosity, exposing a fragility she could not easily mask. Joshua moved closer, gently suggesting, "Sometimes it's enough to just be present, to listen. The rest will follow naturally." The juxtaposition of their behaviors was striking, though unspoken. Where Vivian forced gestures and fabricated smiles, Joshua's warmth radiated quietly, naturally, enveloping the room in a tangible sense of care. The children responded instinctively to him, not because of his position or authority, but because of the authenticity and respect with which he engaged them. His presence became a lens through which the children's own joy and confidence were highlighted, creating photographs that were alive with sincerity, vibrancy, and humanity. Through it all, Vivian's internal conflict became increasingly apparent. She attempted to mirror Joshua's actions at moments, offering a plate here, a smile there, but the effort felt awkward, disjointed. Her comments under her breath, though mostly inaudible to the children, betrayed impatience, discomfort, and a subtle recognition that she was out of her depth in this environment. The community's authenticity, the ease with which genuine care flowed, and the lack of pretense forced her to confront a truth she had long avoided, that influence and appearance alone were insufficient measures of worth. Joshua, ever observant, allowed the process to unfold. He did not force insight, but created space for it to emerge organically. The cameras captured the natural warmth of the volunteers and children, the laughter that could not be rehearsed, and the gentle guidance that Joshua offered at every turn. Vivian's forced participation became part of the narrative, a silent contrast that amplified the campaign's message. Real beauty was not in luxury, in glamour, or in entitlement. It was in character, in compassion, in the small, deliberate acts that revealed the heart beneath appearances. By the end of the day, the campaign had taken shape not as Joshua had imagined initially, but in a form far more powerful and resonant. The photographs radiated authenticity, unvarnished and compelling, capturing the essence of the children, the volunteers, and the quiet dignity of those who worked and participated without expectation of recognition. Vivian, though still resistant, had glimpsed, however fleetingly, the impact of genuine human connection. The day ended with a quiet reflection, a sense that growth and awareness were gradual processes, nurtured through presence, observation, and engagement. Joshua looked across the room one last time, noting the small smiles of children carrying paper hearts, the volunteers' satisfied nods, and even Vivian's tentative gestures toward participation. There was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, yet meaningful, a small opening in the armor of entitlement, a reminder that the possibility of change existed if met with patience, empathy, and integrity. In that space, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and the simplicity of sincere engagement, the campaign had not only captured raw and real beauty, it had reflected the enduring truth that character is the most compelling feature of all. Vivian's frustration had been simmering for days, a quiet storm of indignation masked behind forced politeness and hollow smiles. The tasks she had been assigned, serving lunch, assisting in community programs, observing the production of products from raw materials, felt beneath her, incongruent with the life of privilege and influence she had always inhabited. Each moment in the community center, each encounter with staff and children, seemed to deepen her internal agitation. Her entitlement, so long unquestioned, now collided with the expectation to demonstrate empathy, humility, and patience. The irritation fermented into a quiet, simmering rage, one that demanded an outlet. It began subtly. Vivian cast disparaging glances, whispered cutting remarks under her breath, and allowed impatience to color her gestures. But the simmering discontent escalated, turning into action, into a deliberate attempt to reclaim control and assert dominance in a way she thought clever. She had become fixated on undermining Joshua, on finding a crack in the veneer of his calm authority. That fixation culminated in a plan both desperate and reckless. She would plant a stolen item in Joshua's office and subtly accuse him, hoping to cast doubt on his integrity, disrupt the campaign, and regain some sense of power. Joshua, however, had learned over years of navigating both the corporate world and human behavior that intentions could rarely remain hidden. He had grown perceptive to patterns, to subtle shifts in behavior that hinted at underlying motives. Even in the early stages of Vivian's interactions, he had sensed her unrepentant attitude, the performative charm masking simmering contempt. Acting quietly, he increased security measures and ensured that discreet cameras were positioned to monitor key areas of the office. The precaution was not born of paranoia, but of an understanding that human impulses could be unpredictable, and that protecting the integrity of his company required vigilance. The day of the attempted sabotage arrived with an almost ordinary normality. Vivian moved through the office with a practiced, composed exterior, but the tension beneath was palpable in the subtle tightness of her shoulders, the way her hands lingered over surfaces she did not own, and the flickers of anticipation in her eyes. She placed the item with careful precision, glancing around to ensure no one witnessed the act, her pulse quickening as the moment of deception unfolded. The cameras, hidden discreetly, recorded every movement with clarity, capturing not only the act itself, but the intent etched into her posture, gestures, and fleeting expressions. Later, in a routine board meeting, the supposed discovery occurred. Vivian, playing her part with practiced subtlety, brought up the missing item as if stumbled upon by chance, her voice laced with concern yet tinged with accusation. I found something odd in the CEO's office, she murmured, letting the words hang in the room with a carefully measured ambiguity. The staff exchanged quiet, uncertain glances, sensing the tension, unsure whether this was a misstep, a misunderstanding, or something more calculated. Joshua, maintaining his signature calm, responded with deliberate composure. He allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of the situation settle before speaking. "Vivian," he began softly, his tone gentle yet edged with unyielding clarity. "Attempts like this say more about the accuser than the accused. Are you all right? Stress can make people imagine things." His words were carefully chosen, exposing the futility of the accusation without direct confrontation, revealing the act for what it was with understated precision. He did not raise his voice, did not gesture with accusation. He allowed the truth, captured on camera, to assert itself in the space. The footage was presented with quiet professionalism. The boardroom, previously tense with anticipation, grew still as the recording played. Vivian's actions were unmistakable, captured in their entirety. Her careful placement of the item, the glance over her shoulder, the subtle excitement that betrayed her attempt at deception. The room absorbed the revelation, a collective intake of breath, a subtle recalibration of perception. Board members who had perhaps once assumed charm and influence could obscure character, now regarded her with measured wariness, their trust eroding quietly yet irrevocably. Vivian's composure faltered as the evidence played back, her earlier confidence dissolving in the presence of undeniable truth. She attempted to offer explanations, half-formed and unconvincing, each one undermined by the clarity of the visual record. The room's atmosphere shifted, a quiet tension mixed with a nascent recognition that accountability was inescapable, that actions bore consequences whether mediated by charm or status. Joshua's response, calm and unflappable, created a contrast that was both instructive and disarming. He did not humiliate her publicly. He did not revel in exposure. Instead, he allowed the act of revelation to be the lesson itself, a reflection of integrity over deception, of patience over impulsivity. His eyes met hers briefly, not with triumph, but with a subtle acknowledgement that the opportunity for awareness remained, that the moment could serve as a pivot point for reflection if she chose to embrace it. The board members, sensing the underlying currents, adjusted their demeanor. There was caution now in how they approached Vivian, a quiet reevaluation of trust and judgment. Her reputation within the company shifted, the veneer of elegance and charm cracking to reveal the consequences of entitlement untempered by empathy. Each glance she received, each subtle judgment she felt, reinforced the growing recognition that manipulation and deceit carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Joshua returned to his notes calmly, the meeting continuing with its planned agenda. Yet the subtle lesson had been etched into the room's consciousness. The campaign, the company, and the collective trust of those involved had survived the attempt at sabotage, strengthened by transparency and integrity. Vivian, seated rigidly at the edge of the boardroom table, experienced a tension between indignation and the faint stirrings of reflection. The act had not yielded the power she sought. Instead, it had illuminated the contrast between genuine strength and superficial assertion, between character and pretense. In that quiet aftermath, the trajectory of the campaign and the subtle shaping of perception had taken on renewed significance. The children, the community, the employees, and the brand itself remained untouched by the shadows of manipulation. Joshua's leadership, defined by composure, ethical vigilance, and patient wisdom, continued to guide the company through both external challenges and internal tests. And though Vivian had acted with intent to destabilize, the day ended with the quiet yet profound realization that true resilience, authenticity, and dignity could not be undermined by deceit. Vivian's impatience had reached a new intensity. Days of discomfort, forced engagement, and exposure of her actions had eroded her composure, leaving her desperate and grasping. She was focused now on the one thing that could, in her mind, restore control. The payout she believed was rightfully hers. Calls to her agent became sharper, tinged with irritation and veiled threats. Hints of reputational harm whispered as if casual conversation could intimidate the company. "I don't want trouble," she had said once, voice brittle with both fury and fear. "But the press can be persuasive." Her words carried the weight of entitlement, but beneath it, there was a subtle tremor. A recognition that her hold over circumstances was slipping, despite her attempts to dominate the narrative. Joshua, aware of her maneuvering, scheduled a private meeting with calm precision. The room was quiet, the early afternoon sun soft against the polished conference table, casting long, warm shadows that softened the edges of what could have been a confrontational encounter. The air carried a faint aroma of coffee and papers, a reminder of the mundane, grounded reality that contrasted sharply with the inflated drama Vivian attempted to impose. He sat across from her, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, conveying a presence of authority rooted not in intimidation but in thoughtful clarity. He placed the contract on the table, its pages neatly aligned, and met her gaze with the calm steadiness he had perfected over years of leadership. "This," he said simply, "is the standard contract you signed." The words were matter-of-fact, lacking accusation, but carrying the weight of inevitability. The contract itself was comprehensive, drafted with the care of legal professionals but framed to safeguard not only the company's interests, but the values Joshua held dear. Vivian's eyes flicked to the document, scanning quickly, already restless. Her fingers tapping the polished wood as if urging the meeting to bend to her impatience. Joshua allowed the silence to settle, giving space for reflection. For the understanding that contracts were not arbitrary, they carried intention, expectation, and accountability. "You signed this willingly," he continued softly, perhaps without a full review, "even though you had agents. But it outlines conduct, expectations, and the principles we uphold at JJ Cosmetics." His tone was gentle, yet every word resonated with the weight of ethics, the unyielding insistence that actions had consequences. He leaned back slightly, the calm in his posture emphasizing the contrast to Vivian's mounting agitation. "I want you to understand something," he said, his voice steady but imbued with the memory of his mother's journey. "JJ was built to empower those overlooked and mistreated." "My mother." She worked tirelessly, often unseen, facing disrespect and condescension from people who assumed their worth was greater than hers. This company exists because of her, and because of people like her, who deserve acknowledgement, respect, and opportunity. His eyes softened, tracing the arc of his own memories and the quiet lessons of resilience and dignity that had shaped his life. Vivian's response was immediate, sharp, and dismissive. She scoffed, the sound cutting through the gentle atmosphere like a blade. "Sentiment doesn't pay bills," she said, voice edged with disbelief and irritation. "Without this payout, without the exposure I bring, you're nothing, Joshua. You're nothing." Her words carried a duality, the bravado of entitlement layered over a subtle, barely acknowledged fear, the fear that control was no longer hers to exert, that the universe she had long relied upon for advantage was shifting beneath her feet. Joshua listened, allowing her words to exist without interruption. He did not react with anger or defensiveness. He did not argue against the superficial assertions of power she wielded so carelessly. Instead, he exhaled slowly, a movement that carried both patience and quiet sorrow for the path she had chosen. "I had hoped you would learn," he said gently, the phrase carefully measured, infused with both acknowledgement and disappointment. "But the contract's morality clause, standard for protecting our inclusive brand, covers conduct like discrimination, dishonesty, and actions that harm our community. It is not a punishment, Vivian. It is a framework, a safeguard for those who rely on fairness, respect, and integrity." Her fingers paused on the polished surface of the table, a momentary hesitation betraying the first flickers of awareness. The clause was not obscure or hidden, it was deliberate, a reflection of the values that shaped JJ Cosmetics. Joshua's words, delivered with quiet authority, revealed not a threat, but the inevitability of consequence, the clarity that privilege could not shield her from the ethical expectations of her role. Vivian's gaze flicked to the faces around the room, noting the subtle, respectful attentiveness of the staff who had remained composed, yet watchful. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. The balance of power was no longer dictated by status or fear, but by principle, by the quiet yet undeniable strength of character. Joshua's calm presence anchored the room, the narrative of his mother's life and the company's mission providing context that rendered her threats hollow, her arguments superficial. For the first time, the room held a sense of equilibrium that Vivian could not disrupt, a recognition that integrity and consistency carried a weight no charm or intimidation could overturn. She opened her mouth to argue further, to twist words and manipulate the situation, but found the space for maneuvering shrinking, constrained by the unyielding clarity of Joshua's position. The morality clause, once abstract and legalistic, now took on tangible significance. It was the embodiment of a principle she had failed to understand fully until this moment, that actions, intentions, and respect for others defined one's worth far more than wealth, influence, or notoriety. Joshua allowed the moment to linger, neither pressing nor conceding, giving her the opportunity to reflect, to absorb the lesson quietly if she chose to. The air, once thick with tension and the potential for conflict, softened, revealing the subtle truth that accountability, patience, and integrity could guide outcomes more effectively than confrontation or coercion. Vivian, seated rigidly across the table, felt the first true weight of consequence settle over her, not humiliation, but an undeniable clarity that entitlement, unchecked, could never override ethics, that recognition and success achieved without empathy were fragile and fleeting. As Joshua rose to conclude the meeting, he did so with the same measured grace that had defined every interaction between them. He did not gloat, he did not revel in her discomfort. Instead, he returned to the principles that had guided him through every challenge: patience, ethical consistency, and the quiet insistence that character is the ultimate measure of worth. Vivian's protests remained unvoiced in the room, replaced instead by the subtle, inescapable presence of accountability, leaving a silent yet profound lesson etched into the space, into the fabric of her awareness, and into the ongoing journey of the campaign that would continue to reflect authenticity, empathy, and resilience. The evening of the launch party arrived with the shimmer and anticipation of an event that promised celebration, elegance, and the unveiling of the raw and real campaign. The venue had been transformed into a space that balanced sophistication with warmth, lights casting a golden glow across polished floors, crystal chandeliers reflecting faint rainbows onto the walls. Influencers, celebrities, and members of the press mingled, their laughter and conversation a background hum that filled the expansive room. There was an air of expectation, a collective excitement for the campaign that promised not just glamour, but a narrative of authenticity, of values expressed through every carefully curated image and story. Vivian entered as expected, radiant in designer attire, her tiny dog nestled in her arm, sunglasses masking the slight tension in her eyes. She had convinced herself that the evening would reaffirm her visibility, her influence, and her supposed indispensability to the campaign. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering smiles, nods, and casual greetings, though the tightness in her shoulders betrayed a subtle awareness that the day's earlier discomforts had not entirely faded. Her mind raced, calculating every potential interaction, every impression she might leave, trying to anticipate challenges before they arose. Joshua, observing quietly from the edge of the crowd, did not need to intervene. He allowed the event to unfold naturally, trusting that the narrative of the campaign, combined with the subtle undercurrents of truth and accountability, would speak more powerfully than confrontation ever could. The private investigators he had quietly engaged over the previous months had compiled a careful record of Vivian's ongoing behavior, documenting the patterns of disdain, subtle insults, and unrepentant attitudes that had surfaced both in the community center and within the company. Each clip was a testament not to malice, but to consistent character, or rather, the lack thereof, a stark contrast to the authenticity the campaign sought to celebrate. As the evening progressed, a subtle shift occurred in the air. The program moved toward the unveiling of the campaign's visual narrative, the moment designed to honor the individuals and communities who had contributed to the images that now defined the brand's direction. Vivian, expecting to see herself celebrated, was unaware that the centerpiece of the presentation had been carefully prepared to reveal not only beauty, but the truth of behavior. The lights dimmed slightly, a hush descending across the room as the main screen illuminated. The first images appeared as planned, portraits of volunteers, children, and community members, their expressions candid and radiant, captured in moments of genuine engagement. Vivian allowed herself a small, self-assured smile, believing she had navigated the campaign with the elegance and charm expected of her role. Then the screen shifted, transitioning seamlessly to footage that startled the audience and drew immediate attention. The beach incident, long kept private, now played in clear detail. Vivian's voice, sharp, cutting, and unmistakably arrogant, echoed through the venue. Does he really think he belongs here? Her gestures, her body language, and the audible disdain were undeniable. The juxtaposition of this footage against the warmth and authenticity of the campaign imagery created a striking contrast, one that the audience could not ignore. Murmurs spread quickly, the collective gasp of recognition and disbelief rolling through the room like a wave. The footage continued, moving from the beach to candid moments captured at the community center. Vivian's off-camera insults, whispered mutterings meant to be unnoticed, were now illuminated, her voice revealing both frustration and subtle attempts to undermine the very efforts she was supposed to support. The clarity of her words, combined with the context of genuine care from volunteers and staff, highlighted the incongruity of her behavior and the expectations placed upon her. He thinks he belongs here? Disgusting, repeated on the screen, carried across the room with an eerie resonance. Crystal clear and impossible to dismiss. Vivian's reaction was immediate. She raised her hands, a flustered protest spilling from her lips. "Deep fake! This is edited! This isn't real!" she exclaimed, her voice sharp but betraying a growing panic. Her usual poise cracked, revealing the tension, fear, and disbelief she had long hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed charm. The audience, composed of elites accustomed to control, influence, and curated appearances, now witnessed the unvarnished truth of character laid bare in a public, unavoidable display. Joshua remained calm, his presence a quiet anchor amidst the sudden shift in energy. He did not need to respond aggressively. The evidence spoke for itself. The juxtaposition of her arrogance and her unrepentant behavior against the authentic warmth of volunteers, children, and staff made any rebuttal futile. The room, once alive with casual chatter and anticipation, grew cold with realization. Conversations paused, the air thickened, and even the most composed guests felt the weight of accountability and integrity manifest in real time. Board members and staff exchanged glances. The subtle recognition that Vivian's actions were not isolated incidents crystallizing in the minds of those present. Her attempts to manipulate appearances to maintain the facade of charm and influence had failed entirely. The contrast between entitlement and authenticity, performance and integrity, was undeniable. Each clip, each whispered insult now amplified by the room's attention, reinforced the broader narrative. That character, once revealed, could not be hidden behind wealth, status, or image. Vivian's composure continued to unravel. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her designer bag, and for the first time, her sunglasses failed to conceal the anxiety flickering in her eyes. She opened her mouth again, attempting another denial, but the words faltered, lacking conviction, drowned by the undeniable clarity of the footage. Guests shifted subtly in their seats, some exchanging murmured comments, others simply observing in stunned silence, the power dynamic of the evening irrevocably altered. Joshua, watching with quiet understanding, allowed the moment to exist without interference. This exposure was not intended to humiliate, but to reveal the truth, to allow accountability and recognition to assert themselves naturally. He had long understood that integrity, patience, and consistent observation could achieve more than confrontation or recrimination. Vivian, confronted with the undeniable consequences of her own behavior, now faced a rare and uncomfortable truth that her actions, repeated and unrepentant, had consequences far beyond her control. By the time the screen returned to the final campaign image, children laughing, volunteers engaged, and community members glowing with pride, the room had absorbed a lesson in integrity, humility, and the profound power of authentic action. Vivian, seated rigidly, allowed the realization to settle, the warmth of applause for others juxtaposed against the cold recognition of her own missteps. The viral exposure had not only shifted perception, it had illuminated the enduring truth that real beauty, in every sense, was inseparable from character. The morning after the launch party, the air around Vivian seemed heavier, as though the world itself had shifted, leaving her standing in a sudden, disorienting clarity. She moved through her penthouse suite, sunlight spilling across marble floors, but the warmth of the light offered no comfort. Her phone buzzed incessantly, vibrating against the sleek surface of her desk. Each notification carried a sting, a ripple effect of the night's viral exposure that she could no longer control. Sponsors, once eager to align with her brand, now withdrew their endorsements with polite but firm notices. Influencers and colleagues, some friends and allies who had once smiled in her orbit, began subtly, and sometimes overtly, distancing themselves. The carefully cultivated image of perfection and influence was dissolving, leaving only the residue of her own choices. Her agent, a man she had trusted for years, appeared at her side, his expression tense, almost reluctant. The years of navigating contracts, appearances, and negotiations had made him adept at reading her moods, but this time there was no confident solution to offer. He handed her a folder, its weight symbolic, and spoke quietly, almost as if not to startle her further. "Vivian," he began, voice low and measured, "the morality clause in your contract. It's standard for protecting brands against reputational harm. The board has decided to terminate the partnership immediately, without payout. And depending on further consequences, there may be additional damages for brand injury." Vivian stared at the folder, the words cutting deeper than any public rebuke could. She felt a cold emptiness spread through her chest, a hollow sensation that no designer dress or meticulous makeup could conceal. For years, she had measured success in visibility, in influence, in the ability to command attention and admiration. Now, those measures of worth seemed irrelevant, fragile, and fleeting. The power she had relied upon, the leverage she assumed she held, evaporated before her eyes. The realization pressed heavily against her, an unyielding truth she could not negotiate, charm, or manipulate her way out of. Outside her suite, the world seemed to hum with its usual rhythm, indifferent to her collapse. Social media feeds were alive with clips from the launch party, the footage of her arrogance and disdain juxtaposed against the genuine warmth of Joshua, the children, and volunteers. Comments multiplied by the thousands, voices of support for authenticity, for kindness, for integrity, echoing far louder than her protests could ever hope to. Her reputation, once a carefully curated narrative of perfection, now fractured into irreparable shards, each reflecting the consequences of actions taken without empathy, without accountability, without thought for the impact on others. Joshua, aware of the unfolding consequences yet remaining removed from vindictiveness, approached her with quiet composure. He carried nothing but a small, neatly folded handkerchief in his hand, a gesture of humanity rather than triumph. His steps were deliberate but unhurried, a reflection of someone who understood the weight of human fragility and the necessity of dignity, even for those who had faltered. He did not enter her space with accusation or gloating. He entered it with an offer of reflection, a gentle mirror held up to the truth she had long avoided. Vivian, sitting rigidly on the edge of a chair, stiffened at his approach, a flicker of defiance surfacing before fatigue and the raw ache of exposure replaced it. She met his gaze, the confrontation of his calm, unwavering eyes, forcing her to reckon with herself in a way that no social media backlash could replicate. Joshua knelt slightly, offering the handkerchief with a subtle smile that conveyed no mockery, only quiet acknowledgement of the moment's weight. "Real beauty is in character, Vivian," he said softly, voice steady but carrying the depth of experience. "How we treat others defines us far more than appearances, influence, or wealth ever could." The words, simple yet profound, landed heavily. They reverberated against the walls of her consciousness, echoing the lessons she had ignored, the consequences she had resisted. There was no derision in his tone, no sense of triumph or cruelty. Only the unshakable truth that authenticity and empathy are the foundations of lasting respect, and that these could not be bypassed or purchased. Vivian's fingers closed around the handkerchief, the fabric smooth yet grounding, a tactile reminder of human vulnerability and the unexpected grace that can be extended even to those who have erred. For the first time, she felt the tension in her body loosened, not completely, not immediately, but a subtle acknowledgement that the world could be different if approached with humility and awareness. The weight of status and wealth no longer insulated her from consequence. It could no longer hide the disparity between appearance and reality. Outside her window, the city moved as if unaware, but within the quiet tension of that room, Vivian confronted a pivotal truth: influence without integrity is transient. Power without empathy is fragile, and beauty, in its most enduring form, is inseparable from character. Joshua's presence was a silent testament to this understanding, a reminder that guidance can be offered without condemnation, that lessons can be profound without cruelty, and that accountability need not be punitive to be transformative. In the hours that followed, Vivian began to process the depth of her loss. Sponsors withdrew, social media chatter continued, and the campaign thrived without her. She could no longer rely on manipulation, charm, or status to regain control. The room, once filled with tension and shame, now became a space for reflection, a place where the fragility of pride and the weight of consequence could be acknowledged. The handkerchief remained in her hand, a symbol of both care extended and the stark truth she could no longer ignore. Redemption, if it was to come, would require more than apology. It would require awareness, humility, and a commitment to genuine change. Joshua stepped back, leaving the room with quiet dignity, allowing the natural flow of consequence to continue without interference. The lesson had been delivered not through force, but through clarity, ethics, and the gentle but unyielding insistence that integrity prevails. Vivian sat, absorbing the quiet power of the moment, recognizing for the first time that the path she had taken could be altered if she chose reflection over defiance, authenticity over pretense, and character over image. The confrontation came not in a grand hall or before an audience, but in a quieter space where words carried more weight than spectacle. Vivian stood rigid, her composure finally shattered, anger spilling through the cracks left by fear and loss. Her voice rose, sharp and desperate, the polished accent trembling as she clung to the last symbol of power she believed she still possessed. "My family owns that beach club," she snapped, eyes flashing with wounded pride. "You'll never set foot there again. People like you don't belong." The words were familiar, drawn from the same well of exclusion she had relied on her entire life, yet now they sounded hollow even to her own ears. Joshua did not respond immediately. He watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet attention of someone who understood how deeply fear can masquerade as cruelty. He leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly in front of him, allowing the moment to breathe. When he spoke, his tone was even, almost gentle, as though delivering difficult news to someone already overwhelmed. "That beach club," he said, "doesn't belong to your family anymore." Vivian froze, the certainty draining from her face. Joshua continued, his voice steady, grounded in truth rather than accusation. He explained that for months he had been negotiating quietly, respecting the process, understanding that real change often happens behind closed doors rather than under spotlights. Financial strain, mounting debts, and the unsustainable weight of appearances had forced her family's hand. Motivated sellers, difficult decisions, contracts signed not with celebration, but resignation. "The deal closed weeks ago," he said simply. "It happens faster than people expect when the foundations are already cracking." She shook her head, disbelief battling panic. "You're lying," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. Joshua met her gaze, not with triumph, but with an openness that left no room for denial. "It's public record now," he replied. "The club has been restructured. It's open to the public as a community beach." He paused, then added quietly, "Everyone belongs, those who respect others at least." The sentence lingered between them, heavy with meaning. Vivian felt something inside her collapse, a final wall giving way. The place where she had once exercised power, where she had humiliated a stranger without consequence, was no longer hers to guard or weaponize. The realization struck deeper than financial loss. It dismantled the illusion that she could control belonging, decide worth, or gatekeep dignity. Her hands trembled as she searched for words, but none came. The language of dominance had failed her. Outside, the world continued to shift. The viral exposure had done more than damage her reputation. It had opened doors to scrutiny long avoided. Investigations, triggered by tips and resurfaced records, uncovered patterns that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstandings or youthful mistakes. Financial irregularities, funds diverted from charities she had once publicly championed, quiet transactions masked by influence and silence. The image she had curated unraveled thread by thread, revealing choices made without conscience, accountability deferred for too long. The authorities arrived later, not with spectacle, but with procedure. There were no cameras, no dramatic outbursts, only the formal weight of consequence finally catching up. Vivian listened numbly as the charges were read, unrelated on paper to the beach incident, yet inseparable from the same sense of entitlement that had guided her actions. As she was led away, her posture no longer carried defiance. It carried exhaustion, the kind that comes when denial is no longer possible. Joshua stood at a distance, watching quietly. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no sense of victory. Only a subdued sadness, a recognition of wasted potential and choices that could have been different. He felt no urge to look away, but neither did he linger. He understood that justice, when it arrives, does not require witnesses seeking validation. It simply unfolds. As the scene dissolved, Joshua's thoughts drifted back to his mother, to the lessons learned through hardship and humility. He remembered her hands, worn but gentle, teaching him that dignity is not claimed by exclusion, but earned through respect. Standing there, he felt the weight of closure, not as an ending, but as a necessary reckoning. The beach, now open and shared, symbolized something larger than ownership. It represented the possibility of redefinition, of spaces reclaimed not by power, but by principle. Vivian disappeared from view, escorted into a future she could no longer manipulate. What remained was silence, and within it, the faint but undeniable possibility that even the hardest fall can plant the seed of awareness. Joshua turned away, not in triumph, but in quiet resolve, carrying forward the belief that, while consequences are unavoidable, compassion can still coexist with accountability. The world did not cheer, but it shifted, subtly and irrevocably, towards something more honest. Months passed, not in a rush, but with the quiet steadiness of things finally settling into their proper place. The noise that once surrounded the scandal faded into something more distant, replaced by work that felt purposeful again. When the new campaign finally launched, it did so without arrogance or spectacle. It didn't need to shout. Its power came from sincerity. Across the city, billboards appeared one by one, catching people by surprise. There was no flawless celebrity stare, no airbrushed perfection. Instead, there was Sarah. Her hair was tied back simply, a few loose strands framing her face, her smile unguarded and genuine. She stood alongside teachers, caregivers, young people from the community center, elders whose eyes carried stories of endurance and hope. Their faces weren't posed to impress. They were present, grounded, human. At the bottom of every image, the words were simple and unwavering. Beauty is character. People stopped to look. Some longer than they intended. Something in those faces felt familiar, like a reminder of themselves or someone they loved. Online, the campaign spread not because it was engineered to go viral, but because it resonated. Comments appeared from people who felt seen for the first time, who recognized dignity in expressions usually ignored. Sarah received messages from strangers thanking her, telling her that her kindness, once almost punished, now stood illuminated for the world to witness. She cried more than once reading them, overwhelmed not by fame, but by the realization that her quiet decency mattered. Joshua watched it all from a distance. He didn't seek interviews or center himself in the narrative. For him, the campaign was never about redemption through exposure. It was about alignment, about honoring the hands that built something meaningful long before success arrived. He thought often of his grandmother, of recipes passed down with patience, of his mother returning home tired but proud, teaching him that worth is not granted by status, but revealed by how one treats others when no one is watching. One morning, with the sun low and warm, Joshua returned to the beach. It no longer bore the sharp edges of exclusivity. The gates were open, the path worn not by privilege, but by footsteps of all kinds. Children ran freely across the sand, their laughter cutting through the sound of the waves. Families unpacked simple lunches, friends spread towels close together. Strangers exchanged nods that carried an unspoken understanding. You belong here too. Joshua found a quiet spot and sat down, letting the sand settle beneath him. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the salt air. There was no tension in his shoulders this time, no need to brace himself. When he opened his eyes, he watched a young child offer a seashell to another, watched an older couple walk slowly along the shoreline, hands intertwined. The scene was ordinary, and that was its beauty. He smiled, not broadly, but with a softness that came from peace rather than victory. He understood now, more deeply than ever, that justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it unfolds through patience, through choices made consistently, through the courage to hold on to values even when it would be easier not to. Healing, he realized, isn't about watching someone fall. It's about creating a world where fewer people feel the need to push others down to stand tall. As the sun climbed higher, Joshua stood and brushed the sand from his hands. He felt lighter, not because the past was erased, but because it had been transformed into something purposeful. The beach behind him buzzed with life, open and shared, a quiet testament to the idea that dignity multiplies when it is not hoarded. Stories like this matter because they remind us of who we can be: patient, accountable, compassionate, and brave enough to choose character over cruelty. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep stories of humanity, justice, and renewal alive.